The lights of the studio flickered as the cameras rolled, signaling the beginning of what promised to be an unforgettable episode. The audience, a mixture of eager fans and curious skeptics, sat in anticipation, clutching their phones and adjusting their seats. The host, Ethan Caldwell, was known for his sharp, progressive views and his ability to get the most out of his guests, often making them squirm with uncomfortable questions. He had earned a reputation for being able to provoke anyone, from politicians to Hollywood icons, into revealing something raw, something real. But today, he had a different challenge, and his guest was none other than the legendary Sylvester Stallone. Stallone, sitting across from him, looked as composed as ever. The iconic actor, who had defined the very idea of toughness in Hollywood, was dressed casually but exuded a confidence that made him untouchable. His rugged demeanor was matched only by the calm in his eyes, a silent strength that came from years of being under the spotlight. Ethan, however, had a plan. He was going to challenge Stallone's entire image, to make him confront what Ethan believed was an outdated view of masculinity. "Mr. Stallone," Ethan began, flashing his trademark grin, "you've always been a symbol of American toughness, but in today's world, do you think that kind of masculinity is outdated? I mean, don't you think we need to redefine strength to be more inclusive?" The audience waited for Stallone's response, some nodding in agreement with the host's words. Ethan was sure this was a moment where he could make his mark. Stallone, after a brief pause, leaned forward in his chair, his voice calm but firm. "You mean, do I think being tough is a problem now?" Stallone asked, his brow furrowed as he let the question hang in the air. Ethan, sensing an opening, smirked. "I think it can be toxic when it discourages vulnerability. Yes." Stallone chuckled softly, the sound rich with sincerity. "You're serious?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You think toughness is a problem?" Ethan pushed forward, undeterred by the lack of immediate agreement. He had done his homework, and he wasn't about to back down now. "Yeah," he said, leaning in. "I think that kind of outdated thinking just doesn't belong in today's world. We need men who are more in touch with their feelings. We need heroes who don't rely on brute strength to solve problems." Stallone didn't flinch. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "If someone broke into your house tonight, do you want a tough guy in there? Or do you want someone who's going to sit down and talk about their feelings?" The room fell silent. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. A few gasps rippled through the audience as they absorbed Stallone's words. Stallone wasn't done. Toughness ain't about punching walls or yelling the loudest. It's about standing your ground when life knocks you down. It's about protecting your family. It's about discipline, respect, and hard work. The audience began to stir, sensing the shift in the conversation. Ethan, once confident, now looked uncertain. But he wasn't going to give up. Hollywood has glorified violence, though. He shot back, trying to regain control. It's all about solving problems with fists, guns, or just brute force. Don't you think we should be giving kids a more progressive kind of hero? Stallone paused. Hollywood glorifies a lot of things. You ever seen a movie where a guy saves the world by filling out paperwork? Laughter erupted from the audience. Even Ethan's crew members couldn't help but crack a smile. But Ethan wasn't about to concede. "Okay," he said, straightening up. "Let's talk about the real world. Society's changing. People are questioning what it means to be a man, what it means to be tough. Some might argue that your version of toughness, the old school, don't show weakness kind, is part of the problem. Don't you think it creates more division than unity?" Stallone's eyes never left Ethan's. You ever meet a firefighter, a cop, a guy in the military, or even a single mom working 2 jobs to keep food on the table? You think toughness is their problem? Ethan's expression faltered. The audience, who had been watching with rapt attention, seemed to be leaning towards Stallone's side. He wasn't just talking about fictional characters anymore. He was speaking about real, everyday heroes. "Toughness is what keeps the world running," Stallone continued, his tone steady. "The problem isn't toughness. The problem is people thinking strength is something bad. Like it's dangerous. Weakness ain't a virtue, pal. Strength with control. That's what keeps people safe. Ethan had no response. His mouth opened, then closed again. The room was dead silent, the shift in energy palpable. Stallone's voice lowered again, as if delivering the final blow. You want to know the real problem? It's not toughness, Stallone said, his gaze unwavering. It's people who talk about toughness like it's the enemy while living in a world built and protected by tough people. You sit here in your nice suit with your scripted questions trying to tell me what's outdated. Let me tell you something, man. If the world ever really goes sideways, if things get bad, you're going to be real happy there are still guys like me around. Ethan's face flushed a shade of red that betrayed his usual composure. He hadn't expected Stallone's words to hit so hard. The room was no longer on his side. There was a subtle but unmistakable shift. The audience had been drawn in by his usual style, expecting the familiar dance of sharp questions and clever retorts. But Stallone wasn't playing by the same rules. Ethan blinked, trying to regain his footing. He was a pro. He had dealt with big names before, but this felt different. The energy in the room had changed, and the audience was no longer just watching. They were hanging on Stallone's every word. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to push past the discomfort. I understand what you're saying, he began, but his voice lacked its usual strength. But we can't ignore the fact that your films and the image you've built for yourself glorify violence. You've played characters who solve problems with their fists, guns, and sheer force. How do you reconcile that with the message we need to send to the younger generation? Stallone raised an eyebrow, unflinching. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed yet commanding. Let me tell you something about films, he said slowly, his voice low and deliberate. Movies are stories. They're not real life. I never actually went 15 rounds with Apollo Creed, never took down an entire army with a red bandana, and I sure as hell never ran up those steps in Philly to fix anyone's problems. The audience laughed at the familiar reference to Rocky, but Ethan wasn't ready to let go. Yes, but the culture you've built, the heroes you portrayed, they still carry weight. They shape how people, especially kids, view strength and masculinity. Do you ever worry that people might take those images too literally? Stallone chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. You ever hear of a guy named Spider-Man? He asked, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. He swings around in tights, saving people with webbing. Does that mean every kid who watches him should start jumping off buildings thinking they can do the same? No, they get the message. You stand up for what's right, no matter what it takes. And that's exactly what my characters represent. The words hung in the air, the crowd silently processing the impact. Ethan shifted in his seat, a nervous tick betraying his usual confidence. Okay, fair enough, he said after a moment, clearly stalling for time. But there's more to this, right? We're talking about an entire culture of hypermasculinity that can be harmful. The kind of thinking that keeps people from expressing their feelings, from opening up, from being vulnerable. Stallone's expression softened for just a moment, as if considering the weight of Ethan's words. But then he spoke, his voice firm, carrying an authority that cut through the noise. Let me ask you something, he said, leaning forward again, his gaze intense. You ever met a firefighter? A cop? A soldier? Those guys go out every day, putting their lives on the line to protect others. You think they're walking around worrying about their feelings. Ethan's face twisted in confusion, and Stallone pressed on. You see, the problem isn't strength. It's that people are too quick to label it as toxic, as if being tough is inherently bad. Those who stand firm when the world falls apart aren't the problem. It's the people who don't understand what it takes to keep things running. The ones who sit back and criticize, but never step up to the plate when it matters. The room went quiet, the weight of Stallone's words settling on the audience. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly losing his grip on the conversation. His usual smirk had faded, replaced by the kind of hesitation he wasn't accustomed to showing. You're saying that toughness is what keeps us safe? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Stallone nodded, Absolutely. Strength with control, strength with discipline. That's what keeps families, communities, and countries safe. But you want to act like it's something dangerous, something that needs to be silenced. No, that's not the answer. And it's not the answer for America either. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to counter. But for the first time in the entire interview, he was at a loss for words. He could see the audience reacting, some nodding in agreement with Stallone, others simply staring at him in disbelief. It was clear that the tables had turned, and Ethan's carefully constructed narrative was slipping away from him. "Let me tell you this," Stallone continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through countless battles, both on-screen and off. "The world is full of tough people, people who do what's necessary, not because they're trying to be tough, but because they know it's what needs to be done. When the world gets rough, you'll be glad that there are still people who stand their ground. People who don't fold under pressure. People like me." The audience broke into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a statement. Ethan's jaw tightened, but there was nothing he could do. He had lost the room, and for the first time in his career, he was the one on the defensive. Stallone stood up, straightening his jacket and flashing a small smile. "You can spin it however you want, Ethan," he said, turning toward the cameras. "But at the end of the day, it's about character. It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching. And that's something you can't fake." As Stallone walked off the set, the audience continued to cheer. Ethan, still seated, wiped his brow, realizing that this wasn't just another viral moment. This was a complete and total shift in the power dynamic. Stallone hadn't just defended himself. He had turned the tables in a way no one expected. The cameras cut to black, but the conversation didn't end there. As the interview clip went viral, social media exploded, and the world saw Stallone for what he truly was. Not just a tough guy on screen, but a man who stood by his principles unshaken and unapologetic. The next morning, Ethan's show was a trending topic, not because of his success, but because of his failure. The internet had already decided. Stallone had won, and Ethan Caldwell had been left speechless. But as the dust settled, a much deeper conversation had begun. It wasn't about Stallone or Ethan anymore. It was about what true strength really meant. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Ethan Caldwell's phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages, but none of them were the kind of congratulatory messages he had grown accustomed to. Instead, they were filled with concern, questions, and even a bit of disbelief. The interview with Stallone had gone viral, but for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't the brilliant, perfectly orchestrated takedown Ethan had envisioned. No, it was the exact opposite. He had been schooled in front of millions, left speechless by a man who had mastered the art of silence and calm. In the days that followed, Ethan's show saw its ratings dip. The once constant stream of positive feedback had been replaced with harsh critiques. People who had once praised Ethan for his sharp, pointed questioning were now questioning his credibility. The public was less interested in the words he spoke and more intrigued by the way he had crumbled under pressure. Meanwhile, Stallone's influence only grew. The viral video of the interview continued to gain traction, playing in living rooms, coffee shops, and workplaces across the country. But it wasn't just the laughter that people remembered. It was the message behind Stallone's words. The real strength wasn't in a punch, but in resilience, discipline, and the ability to stand tall when others tried to bring you down. Social media buzzed with discussions, memes, and clips from the interview. Comments flooded in from all walks of life. The elderly man at the gas station, watching the interview on his phone, shaking his head with a knowing smile. The retired Marine who shared a Facebook post, praising Stallone for embodying real strength. The single mother from Oklahoma, who had fought tooth and nail to raise her kids and make ends meet, echoing Stallone's sentiments about the true meaning of toughness. One of the most impactful moments came from a video posted by a construction worker who had watched the interview with a mix of awe and appreciation. "Stallone gets it," he said, staring at the camera, his hands calloused from years of hard work. "Strength isn't about being a bully or a hero in movies. It's about getting up every damn day, doing what needs to be done, and taking care of the people around you. The message was clear. Stallone had sparked a conversation about real strength, one that went beyond the physical. It was about character, integrity, and resilience. The kind of strength that isn't loud but unyielding. The kind that holds families together, keeps communities safe, and drives individuals to keep going, no matter what life throws at them. Ethan, meanwhile, tried to navigate the fallout. His PR team worked overtime, trying to downplay the incident, but nothing could stop the tide of negative attention. Even his colleagues in the media, who once praised his confrontational style, began to distance themselves. One former ally even tweeted, "A lesson in humility. Sometimes, the truth speaks louder than words." And then there was Stallone, who remained silent. He didn't need to respond to the growing wave of commentary. His words had already done the talking. The man who had once been mocked and underestimated for his portrayal of tough guy characters had turned the table in the most unexpected way. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply stood his ground, unapologetically, without needing validation from anyone. In the following week, as the interview continued to dominate headlines, Stallone gave a brief statement in an unexpected place. A local gym in San Diego. A reporter, who had caught wind of the viral moment, asked Stallone about his thoughts on the reaction. With a shrug, Stallone simply said, "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just being honest," and that was all he needed to say. For Ethan, though, the damage had already been done. His show's ratings never fully recovered, and the network quietly began shifting him away from high-profile interviews. The public's perception had shifted, and for the first time in his career, Ethan Caldwell wasn't the one controlling the narrative. It was Stallone, the man who had not just outlasted but outsmarted him. It wasn't about the interview anymore. It was about what Stallone had exposed. A deeper conversation about toughness, vulnerability, and the narratives we tell ourselves. It was a wake-up call for the media, for society, and for every person who had ever been told they needed to be louder, stronger, or more visible just to be heard. By the end of the week, Ethan was no longer the story. The narrative had shifted. It wasn't about Hollywood or media manipulation. It was about what it meant to be truly strong, to hold your ground when the world around you seems determined to make you bend. Stallone's legacy, once solely defined by his iconic movie roles, had grown. He wasn't just a character on screen. He was a real-life symbol of resilience. His calm, measured words had resonated with millions of people, from firefighters to single mothers to military veterans. The viral moment wasn't a fleeting moment of fame. It had sparked a cultural shift. The truth was undeniable. Strength wasn't about how hard you hit or how loud you shouted. It was about standing firm, staying true to yourself, and knowing when to let your presence speak for itself. As for Ethan, he couldn't ignore the reality any longer. The moment had passed, and though he may never admit it, there was a lesson buried in the silence between his words and Stallone's, one he would carry with him for a long time. And for everyone watching, the message was clear. Toughness isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be respected.